Hello everyone, my name is Mark, welcome to my messy studio and my art channel. Today I'm going to be covering a much requested topic, how to sketch people in pen and ink. I think many of you out there would love to be able to whip out a sketchbook and quickly draw the inhabitants of a coffee shop or passengers in a metro, but to do it well is a very difficult thing to do. The problem is, people in their natural habitat, in the wild, aren't posing for you like they would in a figure drawing workshop. People move, the lighting is bad, and to complicate things further, you have to deal with the clothing, accessories, headphones, bags, etc. So, how do we draw something that is constantly fidgeting, poorly lit, and what's worse, might run off to go to the bathroom at any moment? Well, you might not like what I'm about to tell you, but when sketching from a less than ideal subject, you have to rely as much on what you see as what you know. This means that when I'm sketching, let's say, a face, I'm actually drawing from my experience, drawing thousands of similar faces to reinforce what I'm having difficulty seeing. When drawing clothing, I'm using my understanding of the different kinds of folds and how they interact with the forms underneath to reinforce things that I'm not seeing all that clearly or things that are moving. And when shading, I'm using my understanding of light logic, the way light falls on objects, the kind of shadows that are being created, to give additional clarity to forms that might not be exactly clear because there are multiple light sources or light that's just moving around all over the place. The balance between drawing what I see versus drawing what I know will vary depending on what I'm drawing, but generally speaking, the faster I have to draw, and again, the less ideal the drawing conditions are, the more I have to draw from my past experience. A large part of past experience is simply observational drawing, which allows you to grow your inner visual database, your vocabulary of images, and to work from it. But another part of it is technical knowledge of anatomy, of fabrics and folds, of lights and shadows that allow you to think through your drawing and add additional information. So, to sketch people well, you have to learn how to draw the figure from observation, and then learn anatomy and figure construction so that if someone moves, or shifts, or just disappears entirely, you're able to fill in those missing details. Then, you have to learn how to draw clothing from observation, and then learn the various types of folds, pipe folds, diaper folds, zigzag folds, all that kind of stuff, so that should the folds change, you can fill in that missing information as well. And you have to learn how to shade from observation, and then learn how light works so you can shade effectively even if the light is horribly confusing. Now, obviously, learning all of this stuff requires years and years of diligent study and practice. But what can you do to improve your ability to sketch people right away? Well, I'm sad to report, right away, probably nothing. But I do think there is something you can start to implement that can, in a relatively short amount of time, make you better, and it's to learn to start your sketches using what I call the armature process. So let's talk about what armatures are and why they're so darned important. Let's get started. While some artists are able to just start in one spot and work their way out, drawing everything in detail like some kind of printer, this is actually not the best way to go about it, particularly with difficult subjects. The problem with diving into detail first is that it's impossible to focus on the details and see the big picture at the same time. To show you what I mean, I'm going to do two side-by-side drawings. In this first drawing, I'm starting in one spot and working my way around as best I can. Because I'm focused on one spot at a time, I can't see the big picture, so while I might get the small stuff right, the overall figure ends up with all kinds of large proportional problems. And because I'm afraid to make mistakes, my lines are more timid and less expressive. While I might, on occasion, get things right and get a good drawing out of it, this is a difficult, unsystematic way of working with a low success rate, at least for me. However, the biggest issue with working this way is not the increased chance of making all kinds of proportional errors. It's that if my figure moves, I'm going to have a very difficult time completing the drawing. In the second drawing, I'm starting with an armature. Using the armature process allows me to quickly indicate the proportions, freeing me up to focus exclusively on detail. However, the main advantage of doing an armature is that it allows me to fix the pose, so that when the person I'm drawing inevitably moves, I'm still able to use the armature and my visual database of anatomy, folds, and light logic to guide me in completing the drawing. As you can see, the armature only defines the basic shapes that I'm seeing without going into detail. Why do I not pencil in further? Would that not give me an even more accurate drawing? Yes, it would, and when I'm doing highly finished illustrations where precision is important, I will pencil in all the details before I start to ink. But there's a trade-off between precision and expression. With a detailed pencil sketch, you stop looking at your subject and only trace over your lines. Because you're now tracing as opposed to drawing, your lines will inevitably become stiffer and less expressive. By taking the armature up to the simple volume stage and stopping there, it allows you to continue looking, continue responding to what you're seeing, making your lines more spontaneous and expressive. When sketching people in the field, where there is time pressure and precision is not the priority, there's a lot of benefit to not doing a detailed sketch. You might think that an armature is simply a loose pencil sketch, but it's actually much more than that. The term comes down to us from sculpting and refers to the initial wire structure used by sculptors to support the clay placed on top. For our purposes, the armature is a simplified version of the human body composed of geometric volumes that allow you to quickly determine the scale, proportion, and gesture of the figure, without getting bogged down with details that will quickly change if the figure changes positions. Most importantly, and this is where an armature differs from a pencil underdrawing, it allows us to think in 3 dimensions, to analyze how the forms are oriented, giving us a better understanding of what we're drawing, resulting in a stronger work of art. Now that I've hopefully convinced you of the value of starting with an armature, let's talk about how they're done and what you can do to become proficient at using them. Here's what the armature on a standing figure needs to look like. We're going to start off with the head, which is going to be an oval, like this. The neck needs to be a cylinder. That's going to look like this. And then that cylinder is going to sit on top of another oval that's going to be slightly larger. Then that oval is going to sit on another cylinder, which is going to sit on top of a sphere. And then we have cone shapes for the legs. Top leg, bottom leg. And the feet are going to be wedge shapes, so they're going to look like this. Then we're going to draw little ovals for the shoulders that look like this. And then for the arms, you're going to draw cylinders that look like this. And the hand is going to be a flattened block. Now, the most important thing when you're drawing the armature is to pay attention to the overall proportions of the shapes that you're drawing. Now, proportions will vary depending on the person you're drawing from, but at the beginning, I like to start off with something sort of generic, something average, and as I get better at drawing my armatures, then I can make little adjustments, longer legs, wider shoulders, but for right now, I'm not going to worry about that. So here are the general proportions that I use as a starting point. I'm going to use the head as my unit of measurement. So I'm going to take the length of the head and it's going to be 1 head long. The neck needs to be about half a head long, so 0.5 H. The rib cage needs to be about 1.5, 1.5 H. This cylinder needs to be approximately half a head. The sphere needs to be approximately 1 head. And then the legs, from their starting point here, need to be about 2 heads from here to the middle of the sphere that represents the knees. So it's going to be 2 heads from here. And then from the middle of the sphere all the way down to the heels should be also about 2 heads. For the arms, starting with the shoulder shapes, these shapes need to be about 3/4 of a head size, so 0.75 H. Then the distance from the top of the shoulder to the elbow should be about 1.5. And then from the elbow all the way down to the fingers, also about 1.5. So the arms, starting from the shoulder all the way to the fingers, needs to be approximately 3 heads. Now, notice that I'm not being super exact about the distances. These are rough, and again, they'll vary depending on the model you're drawing from. The key to the proportions here is to make sure that the figure you're drawing is within human range. So long as things more or less sit within these proportions, you're going to get a drawing that looks human as opposed to an alien. So think about this proportional system as the dividers on a road. You might veer a little bit, you might sway a little bit, but this armature chart is going to keep you from going completely in some kind of wrong direction. Now, as far as widths go, you want to make sure the ribcage is, on average, about one head across. The hips should also be about one head across. And the distance from shoulder to shoulder should be approximately 2 heads. So from here to here, about 2 heads. And then from here to here, about, well, I would say about 1.25 heads, right? Sometimes 1.5 heads. The proportions, especially at the beginning, when you're learning the proportional system, the armature system, do not vary. What will vary will be the widths of the forms that you're drawing. So if you're drawing someone very skinny, then these cylinders, these cones are going to thin out. So you might get somebody that's very thin, that looks like this, right? A little narrow waist, right? Little tiny skinny legs, right? Narrow shoulders, right? So on and so forth. Or they might get a little bit wider, right? Somebody looks like this. So the volumes you're drawing will vary depending on the model. However, the proportions up and down will still be the same. So it'll still be one head, half a head for the neck, 1.5 for the rib cage, for the waist, about 0.5 for the hips, right? 1, right? 2 heads, so on and so forth. An important complication in the armature process is that often a pose will have forms that either project forward or backward in space, something that looks like this. The neck is going back, the waist might be coming forward a little bit, and then the legs are coming towards us. Right, maybe this leg is going sideways and the back of the leg, the bottom of the leg, is receding back in space. Poses that are foreshortened. The most important thing to keep in mind is that when you're drawing these cylinders, these cones, you're thinking about their 3-dimensional volume and not 2-dimensional shape. So we want to make sure that we're indicating the fact that these forms are projecting forward. How do we do that? Well, part of it is through compression, the fact that the forms compress as they move forward or back. But a big part of it is to indicate the openings, the ellipses of the forms. Here, here, which should give us a really strong indication of which way they're going. So let's think about a cylinder that's straight up and down. That's going to look like this. The shape of these ellipses is going to be very narrow. So here I have a little cylinder, right? It's straight up and down, and we can just barely see the top elliptical shape and the bottom elliptical shape. As this form starts tilting forward, notice how the ellipse on top and the bottom starts opening up and becoming rounder. So the form compresses, and then the top and bottom ellipses become more rounded. So that's going to be something that looks a little more like this. Right? And then the more the form is tilted towards you, the rounder our ellipses are going to be. Tilt it a little more. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm showing the fact that our forms are coming forward by opening up the ellipses here. Here the form is going down, the ellipse here is a little flatter. Now, these things do not have to be perfectly precise. In fact, in order to be precise, I need to work out the actual perspective of all these forms, which can be difficult to do. But what I am doing is thinking about these things three-dimensionally and analyzing the direction the forms are going, which, when I actually get to the final drawing process, is going to make my drawings feel that much more solid because we've got this understanding of the direction of the form underneath. So this is something that's going to require practice. I'm going to show you examples of this later when I show you the exercises you need to do to improve on this ability. Now that I've hopefully convinced you of the value of starting with an armature, let's talk about how to get good at using them. My advice is to start your armature practice with unclothed figures in simple poses. There are plenty of online resources where you can find images to work from, but you can also use old master drawings for this purpose. Armature practice is a very simple three-step process. First, print out the image and draw the armature directly on it. Then draw the armature next to your reference, and then hold your reference some distance away and draw it. Since I wouldn't be able to show you the reference I was working from on an unclothed model, I'm going to do this exercise using a drawing by Raphael. I recommend lightening the contrast in your reference slightly before printing it, since you'll have an easier time seeing the armature you draw on top. Another tip is to use a graphite pencil, since printing ink will resist chalky media like charcoal. Take your time. Make sure that the armature shapes closely align inside the contours of the figure, and think about all those cones, spheres, and cylinders as three-dimensional volumes. Again, the armature is not just about roughly sketching things in, it's actually about something more, spatial analysis. We're really trying to understand the forms and how they're oriented in order to understand what's going on and draw it better. Now that I've drawn the armature on the print, I'm going to place the print next to my drawing paper and see if I can copy the armature from observation. Try to draw the same size as the print and try to get as close as possible. You might want to do this several times until you can do it accurately and consistently. Once you're done with that, you can take the print and tape it to a wall some distance away and try drawing it. Repeat, repeat, and repeat. I think you'll find each attempt will be slightly closer. Once you're comfortable doing simple poses, try tackling poses of increasing difficulty. Here's a seated pose, also by Raphael. The process is the same. Print the image, draw the armature over it, then draw the armature next to it, then draw the armature with a reference some distance away. This might be a good time to talk about why it's so important to learn to draw unclothed people, even if ultimately your goal is to draw people that are wearing clothing. The practice of figure drawing from observation has a long history in European art, going all the way back to the Renaissance. Besides being inspired by the Greco-Roman obsession with the nude, artists of the Renaissance understood that it's impossible to draw a clothed figure well without knowing the structures underneath. This understanding was not only codified in their training, it also became a part of their painting process to first create a detailed sketch of all the figures unclothed before doing a detailed sketch with clothing. Though I've never tried doing that in my own work, this laborious sketchmaking process makes sense, since clothing generally conforms to the body and indications of anatomy are everywhere on a clothed figure. Now that you've trained yourself to draw armatures of unclothed people, it's time to try doing the same with people that are dressed. While the anatomy of the figures is obscured, there will be clues to the placement of the underlying forms, and if you look closely, you'll find them. Use the exact same training process, start with simple poses wearing simple clothing, and progress to poses of increasing difficulty. Draw directly over the reference, then draw the armature next to the reference, then draw the reference some distance away. In each step, once the armature of the figure is drawn in, start to indicate the clothing, also using simple shapes such as rhomboids, triangles, and cones. The process of doing armatures is frustrating, since at first they'll be wildly inaccurate and not correspond with what you're actually seeing. But little by little, you'll find that they'll start aligning with the reference with increasing frequency, at which point they become a very useful guide. The key here, not to repeat myself, is repetition. Something consistently underemphasized in art education, particularly in academic institutions with their obsession with originality and artistic innovation, is the importance of doing things over and over and over until they're ingrained in your system. While art is certainly an intellectual pursuit, there is much to it that relies on muscle memory, meaning that certain skills need to be practiced regularly and for a very long time in order to be perfected. Think of this armature training as something akin to the way a pianist practices their scales and arpeggios in order to become proficient in their technique. By the way, this is where working from a photo reference is actually better than working from life, since you can repeatedly draw the same pose in order to get it right. Once you've completed these exercises, get out there and find a place where people congregate and do some sketching. Keep in mind that learning to draw armatures correctly takes diligent practice, and improvement will be incremental. So, don't run crying to the comments section because you expected instant results. Furthermore, I couldn't cover everything about armatures in just one video, and there's actually more to the process, such as using orientation lines to determine the tilt and rotation of the forms you're drawing, and indicating anatomical landmarks such as collarbones, trochanters, patellas, etc. If you'd like to learn more about the armature process, I have tutorials for you in my figure drawing playlist. Many of those videos were made during the pandemic when I had to hurriedly take my figure drawing classes online, so those videos are pretty rough, but they do contain a lot of useful information. I've shown this system of working to quite a few students over my 18 years of teaching and can say with confidence that over time this will improve your work significantly. Just be patient with yourself and, most importantly, enjoy the process of learning and getting better. Thanks for watching, please subscribe if you haven't already, and see you in the next lesson.